Yeah, no, I'm going to kind of ignore the camera this week. It's like, I'm speaking to you.
You can start.
You start? Okay, great. Okay, so this last couple of weeks we have spent talking about conceptual frameworks for sacred space and some practicalities, the actual physical structures of the Mishkan and the Mikdash and sort of larger spaces. And this week we're going to move to synagogues, specifically looking at ancient shuls, ancient synagogues in Batei Knasiyot. I'll use all the different words throughout the shir, in Israel and in the diaspora. So the art of ancient shuls as kind of our guiding question in terms of how art informs our sacred space conceptions. I think it's particularly worthwhile to know when we look at shuls, it's not just the architecture as we've talked about last week in terms of temples, but the art that's there leads us to think of the overarching question, which we could have started with 3 weeks ago, but I didn't, and can be a whole separate discussion in and of itself, which is, how do we define art? What is it? Is it, different throughout different eras, and particularly, I think, religious art. It's come to be one of the following. It's our art can be communication, art can be simply decoration, religious icon, altarpiece, scientific experimentation, art as education. We'll see art as midrash, right? Interpretation, art as political expression, what things are selected, what artistic renditions are, do we find in our shuls, in ancient shuls, what does that say about the politics of the era? And that's, I think, these overarching questions, I am dedicating kind of one slide to them, but it's really a question that should be, I think, a precursor to all discussions and really robust discussions about art and art informing our religious sensibilities, so that art doesn't just become a two-dimensional, flattened, pretty picture that sometimes I think, you go to shul, there's like a nice painting up or whatever it is, and like a religious picture that informs, is visually pleasing, but it is worthwhile, and I'm noting it, even though I'm not going to give a lot of, we're not going to have that discussion today, but just those larger questions as to how do we define, and how do we define art in vis-a-vis our religious sensibilities and vis-a-vis our spaces, right?
What would you say is the difference between altarpiece and religious icon?
Just use sort of, those are pretty much the same. Okay. I just sort of, right, is it I guess we can expand upon that. Is it is it something that is a religious centerpiece for the I guess the source where it's coming from is where we can kind of expand upon that. Is that this is part of the tradition, and these were the things that are religiously, aesthetically important to have in a shul, like the symbols, like, right, the icons, the menorah, the aron, those types of things, as opposed to, altarpiece doesn't really get to that, but we can even just address the question, what are the individual artistic expressions that we would choose to have in a shul? And I just, kind of wanted to open that question. How does, from the experiences that you've had in maybe your shul or your religious institutions, do you find that you think about the art that's there? If there is any, I think our move, and next week we'll talk about like modern structures. Our move has in very many ways, shuls have become very sparse, sort of like the modern aesthetic and the idea that the building informs our space, but as we'll see as compared to some of the ancient shuls, the art decorating, I don't know, do you have any perceptions of art as?
So I think that what's most striking about the shul that it's evident most of the time is the light, the windows, like the stained glass windows, and the reflection of the light on the walls is just beautiful. And it adds to the sacredness of the space, and that to me is most sacred. The aron is beautiful also, but we did our shul like shortly before I got there, probably about 10 years ago, and it's very pleasing aesthetic, and it makes it a very special place to be, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so next week for sure, if you can take a picture there during the week, I would
Okay.
love to see it. I'm trying
Okay.
to collect for I guess next week's the last one, contemporary spaces. And one thing I want to look at is windows, where windows are placed and how in certain structures you're defined by the space that you're in, but you're not starting from scratch and placing windows everywhere, but light and windows really plays an important role. In contrast to, and we'll look at real frescoes painted on the walls, and mosaics on the floor. So we're going to look at sort of mosaic in one ancient shul in Israel, and frescoes in another important diaspora. So I just wanted to kind of talk about the role of shuls and the role of the Beit Knesset and the role of synagogue as taking over, like we talked about last week, temple-centric life, and in many ways, the institution of the shul and the synagogue making possible an adaptation of Judaism to a new reality created after the Churban by changing. And when things were so temple-centric, now the shul grows in its, it grows in its importance. That being said, there were shuls before the Churban, right? Archaeologically refined shuls that pre-existed the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. They grew in popularity after the Churban. So it's just important to think of, well, the Beit Knesset as the central place. Obviously, right? It is a reaction, but it's not just a reaction, which makes us think about, well, what role was the shul playing when there was a temple? Right? We know that we do have Beit Knesset on the ground prior to the destruction of the Second Temple.
On the ground of the
meaning, not on the grounds, meaning we have them, they exist. I'm just using the words on the ground. That there were, and I think like the popular conception, even scholarly conception that we push back on a little bit, is that shuls were a reaction to the destruction of the temple, and there's a new reality, and we need to meet that new reality, and the Beit Knesset's going to take the role. Scholars have pointed Professor Larry Schiffman, now at NYU, who's a scholar of Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient worlds, just to name one, has pretty much basically said, no, we know of shuls that exist prior to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, which just leads us to think about the shul as an institutional structure being more perhaps than just the reaction.
I see. Mostly were they outside of Yerushalayim?
Outside of Israel also.
Right.
We can date back. And in that, Professor Schiffman has written about it more extensively, but in that discussion of how the shuls didn't just come into being as a reaction to the destruction, but it did create the mechanism for continuation of the mode of worship with the destruction and exile. Nevertheless, right, most of the shuls and Batei Midrashiyot did proliferate after the Roman destruction.
How about between the Churban Beit HaMikdash Harishon? Did they proliferate after that, before the Second Temple was built?
So I don't know exact numbers and exact offhands. I'll look into that to get at a specific. The assumption is there were private areas of worship, but for exact.
Oh, I don't need
exact.
exact.
No, but I want to get a better
if,
sense of
if it became a phenomenon also after the destruction
after the
of
first. Okay. Our focus today really will be on ancient synagogues, sort of antiquity, 3rd century, 4th century, and we'll look specifically at one example in Israel, and Beit Alpha in Israel, and one example in Galut, in the diaspora, Dura Europos synagogue, which was along the Euphrates in Syria. So we're going to look at each one of those as sort of just one model, one example where the art plays a very central role in the shul. Just some general comments about building art, architecture of ancient synagogues. Professor Lee Levine is a senior professor at Hebrew University, wrote this massive tome published by Yale University called The Ancient Synagogue, and I just sort of, didn't read all 1,200 pages, but I've been really just immersed in it. So it's a phenomenal resource, very easy to read, interesting, comprehensive, just to get the sense of kind of the historical synagogue. But just certain things, general comments to make about ancient synagogue in terms of art, architecture, and location. Really, archaeology is our main source of information, but there is some literary material as well. So when you look at rabbinic literature, and there are certain comments about how from the outside you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell the difference between a Jewish house of worship and a pagan temple. So that's evidence that we're pulling out from the literature as opposed to the archaeology, but it gives us a sense of, how can we mine rabbinic literature and the texts and, Mishnah and the Gemara for any kind of hints. They're not writing about art, they're not talking about architecture per se, but pulling out from the literary end to create a visual is just sort of an interesting, an interesting thing. Before we've found the first significant archaeological remains of a shul, that was the only, the literature was really all that we had to get a sense of the portrait and the picture. The many shuls throughout the Roman Byzantine world that are known to us to date have just a real wide variety of examples in terms of location, the internal appearance, the external appearance, the architecture. There were different designs that were used. Broad house design, basilica, what kind of architecture was used, and the working assumption, most scholars really thought that there were distinct periods, right? This was the broad house period of design, and they matched up chronologically. Wow. And that was sort of, right, when you move through the 3rd century, there was a typical what's called Galilean architecture, which we'll look at in a moment. And then it moved to broad house design. And then, nevertheless, then when shuls started to be uncovered archaeologically, specifically ones that were, close to each other and dating from the same time, then that theory was somewhat debunked because they found shuls that were, these are both 3rd, 4th century shuls in Israel, and they vary in terms of their architectural design and style. So again, it's just interesting to see how there are certain assumptions and theories, and what you find when you uncover, say, look, that one is a broad house design, and right nearby in Beit Shan we have, a different architectural model style, which just enlightens and kind of brings to the fore all the general theories. And shuls in late antiquity would often have a lot of the same types of things that other public buildings of the time had. So courtyards and entrances and main halls with benches and side rooms, ancillary rooms, columns, varied decorations. So that was sort of, this is what a public structure looks like in late antiquity, in Greco-Roman world. And the shul fit that model. And I wonder today, think about public spaces, not just houses of worship, but big public spaces. To what extent do the shuls have those things in mind? That we have a gym and a catering hall. It's the same kind of, this is the community center. But then we have the distinctive, unique Jewish components, which, in antiquity it would be the symbols. The menorah, the inscriptions with the word synagogue, so that we knew when we find it that this was actually a synagogue, because architecturally it could have been any public ancient space. names of specific artisans or people that were involved. We'll see in Beit Alpha who the artisans were, who gave the donations. Those are things that you would find, like we have
today.
Our plaques up on the wall
Right.
and our lists and our the internal orientation of the benches towards Jerusalem. So that's also something when you find, you're trying to figure out, was this a shul? Where are the benches, right? In what direction are they oriented towards Jerusalem? And is there a bima present along the Jerusalem-oriented wall? So that's, again, all of these, like, we have this hybrid of, there are lots of elements to the building that might look like any public structure, and yet we have the distinctive Jewish elements. So archaeologists, scholars, upon finding a building, might sometimes say, hey, this is a church, and then put together like the pieces and say, hey, no, this is a shul. And the presence and, suddenly in random places where shuls will show up across the Mediterranean is kind of astounding also. Like, we would have ever thought that there was a shul here, and suddenly we see an inscription or menorah in the southernmost, part of coastal Italy, and voila, like no one even knew there was a Jewish community there.
Right.
And then suddenly there's a shul that shows up there.
Wow.
And the location of the shul in and of itself, there were preferences in Israel. The preference for the most part was that a Beit Knesset would be at the center of town or a village for easy access for people to come to. Nevertheless, we have found many that are not centrally located on the outskirts of town. In the Gemara, in the Babylonian Talmud and Talmud Bavli, there are discussions about the shul being on the outskirts of town and having to go there for particular, there'd be particular needs, leaving. So again, there we have a sense of, well, the literature tells us that central place was not necessarily, like the Beit Knesset was not necessarily in the middle. So varied presentations of where it was, not just the orientation of what direction it's facing, but actually where within the physical location of a community, which I guess kind of relates to last week when we talked about the different depictions of the Mishkan being in the center versus being on the periphery.
Right.
If you have a Beit Knesset in the middle of town, easily accessible, it really speaks to certain
Values.
elements and values, as opposed to it's outside. Why would it be outside? What do we want the center of town to be? Do we want those things to be transmitted back? And do we want people to make the effort to have to go and not just, by the way, I pass it on my way to work, and all kinds of values that will be, that become influenced in terms of where physically it is vis-a-vis the majority of the population. I guess without having to deal with zoning laws and codes and real estate prices
they may well have existed then
that
too.
are soaring. Okay, let's look at the Beit Alpha synagogue. Beit Alpha is a 3rd century synagogue, and it's located at the northern slopes of the Gilboa Mountain region near Beit Shan in Israel. So just a more zoomed out view. It's not, Beit Alpha is not marked on this map, but it's kind of near Beit Shan. So a bit north, east. The shul itself, Beit Alpha itself was a small agricultural village established in the 1st century or so. The shul itself, archaeologists have dated to the 3rd century, with mosaic floor is what we'll focus on, dating from the 6th century, and we know that from an inscription that we'll look at in a moment. And the artists are named in the mosaic inscription. The shul functioned even when Israel was under kind of Arab control in the 8th century, in the 7th century, but it was destroyed in a massive earthquake in 749, which leveled a lot of the cities and towns in the regions, and basically the irrigation in the area and the water channels in the area, all forces basically made that whole area between Afula and Beit Shan just one big swamp. So the shul was, and the whole land was basically prevented from being used. Like the whole region was basically deserted until the Jewish resettlements of Emek Yisrael in the 1920s. And in 1928, the shul, here's just a picture of the initial archaeological, the shul was uncovered in 1928 by members of nearby kibbutz Chavtiva. They were working on irrigation construction in the area to drain the swampy area, and they hit upon this shul, and they called in, famous archaeologists and of the time, and excavations started in 1929 under the auspices of Professor Sukenik, Elazar Sukenik, who was the historian who acquired the Dead Sea Scrolls. So he was the one who was to oversee this dig. His son, the famous archaeologist, and General Yigal Yadin changed their name, so this is his father. And in this picture, all the way to the right, is Professor Sukenik overseeing the initial dig. So the man on the right, it's not the lightest picture. It was the best. I looked for different. It was in one of the books. I looked for a better copy, but so just to get a sense of that moment, and I think just to think of it also in terms of the sacred space tied with sacred land, how important of a discovery and dig this was in terms of Zionist mobility ideology. This is the first ancient synagogue uncovered by a Jewish archaeologist in the newly founded land of Israel. Wow. It's wow.
Well, I thought it was in the 1920s.
But it was the first shul.
Oh,
Yes. It was the first shul to be uncovered in Israel with the rise of Zionism. So before the state was established, but with the rise of modern Zionism. Yeah. There was a second round of excavations in 1962 under the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority, under the auspices of the IAA, and in that excavation they explored kind of a lot of residential structures that were around the area as well. So
is this shul now restored?
So we are going to look at this shul. If you want to look at the inside today, what it looks like, we're going to go to it in a second. So this is a whole bunch of different, I can flip through and then we'll go back. There's now they built a modern structure basically over this mosaic floor, which we'll look at together a little bit more carefully. I think these are all the pictures here. We're gonna go through each element, but just so that you get a sense of the space, and there's ramps around so you can walk around it, but it's essentially a museum open to the public.
It looks like an altar what you just passed.
That and that.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's where the Arun was and the apse there. So let's look at let's just go through it step by step. So this is sort of archaeologically the reconstruction. Basically, this is a model. It's near the entrance to the museum. When you go there, there's this model of basically what they envisioned the whole structure looked like, because then we found the bottom, obviously the floor. It was a 2-story rectangular structure facing southwest towards Jerusalem. The roof was covered by ceramic tiles. The upper level on the second story probably that's where the Ezrat Nashim was housed. And there was an open courtyard. And then the central hall basically consisted of the central interior. And this also was a model. This model, I think this is a picture. I'm pretty sure that this model is at the Center for Jewish History exhibit. I think this years ago, I don't know the exact year, there was another exhibit there called Sacred Realm. And specifically about shuls and antiquity. And I think this model, it's definitely in the museum catalog.
Right.
But
I was going to say, they also have some replicas I was recently at the Jewish Museum. They have some replicas of old synagogues there too, but not that, I don't know that this one was that.
Okay. Yeah, so this is Okay, so this was, this is a model of what the central prayer hall looked like. So you had that central area with this enormous mosaic, which we'll look at, two side aisles, separated by 8 stone pillars. So here you have kind of right, the lower end of the pillar. Oops, sorry about that. And then the front, right, in that little niche is where the Aron was. There's 3 steps going up.
Any idea as to why it's missing?
So what's missing?
The Aron.
Well, what was actually, it was probably either taken out or destroyed over time, or, I imagine, a lot of the fixings and the accoutrements were not found. We have certain seals and different places uncover lots of different menorah, pottery, things that were maybe used in the shul.
Right, but the Aron could have been a fixed structure. That's why I was asking.
Oh, so I imagine that probably it wasn't. I don't know. Well, if you look at here, let's look at.
Yeah, I guess in most shuls it's not.
So now we have the Aron. I guess that's an interesting question. Also, like in the big midrash downstairs, right, the whole wall is the Aron, and you slide the doors, and it's a central part, but. Doesn't always, right, isn't always, and that in and of itself is an interesting question in terms of, is this designed to be, like, is it just a function of the space, or do we want the Aron to be permanently fixed, or is it something that,
movable like the Mishkan?
Exactly, like an element to being mobile, and that's important, and, I guess I would assume that it was not a fixed structure. And it was in that here's just the picture of the steps leading up to where the Aron was presumably housed. I mean, it's the raised recess that we have there.
It's so interesting how obviously the architectural styles are influenced by the times of the period. And this is like, it resembles the Roman style. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
And we'll look, the center is a giant zodiac wheel. Which was totally influenced by, right, a pagan design aesthetic common in everywhere, but common also in shuls. They found like 7 or 8 different shuls that had the zodiac as this like central thing. Well,
it's also a very Kabbalistic concept.
And why that would be the center, and it leads to all sorts of questions as to, well, who's actually designing the mosaic here? Who's designing the art? Is it just someone who commissions it, makes the determination? Is it a communal thing? Are the artisans themselves Jewish? Are they not Jewish? And that lends to all kinds of questions of space. Who, do I specifically get a Jewish architect, artisan to consult, to build, to do, so that it informs the space, or is this just an aesthetic thing and I'm going to look for a great stained glass window artist, and it doesn't really matter who they are. So today, again, contemporarily, there are people whose niche in their profession is like on consults on designing shuls. So but in it questions in the ancient world, like who knows who made the decision and how it was arrived at. Was it a kind of egalitarian democratic discussion? Did we have a shul vote over what decor we want on the floor? It's very just getting in the mindset of the ancient art as opposed to kind of how we operate in our shuls today. And then there was a board meeting about it, and then we rejected that window because it was too out there. And I earlier in the year was in a shul in La Jolla, beautiful shul in California, and I'm totally forgetting the name. The shul and the rabbi. Regardless, it's a beautiful aesthetic, beautiful space. And I noticed that the Aron and the bima were a carved wood, and I just noticed it when I was davening. And afterwards, the rabbi told me that his father was, you know, an educator his whole life and an artist, not, you know, an artist by hobby, not by trade, and that he spent years carving the bima and the aron for his son for this shul.
Wow.
It was gorgeous, like absolutely. And it's suddenly
Wow.
that piece of information, knowing that, oh, your father made that. Like, I don't know. It just
Wow.
it spoke to
That
me.
means that rabbi is there forever. He's not going any place.
I think the community loves it.
Yeah.
But it just, you know, it suddenly spoke to when I was thinking of these questions of, well, who did this mosaic? And, like, were they affiliated? Were they not affiliated? What did they know? But, you know, it reminded me of that interaction that I had with him when he told me that, yeah, my father made this over years, and now it's housed. I was just like, wow, that's like, and it was really just, you know, beautiful, intricate, and yeah, it was just an interesting moment of the family kind of dynamic there in terms of the art of the shul. So basically there are 3 panels, or different, to this large mosaic. The side is, you know, the sides have just basically decorations, geometric patterns, and fruit. But in the front we have an inscription, which is in Aramaic and in Greek. We'll look at the inscription. Then the next panel is a mosaic of Akedat Yitzchak, the scene of Akedat Yitzchak. Then there's the zodiac wheel beyond that. And then beyond that are but the ark ritual elements. So this is the frontmost panel, mosaic panel. So you have the aron, you have the lions on the side, the menorah. So and that would make sense. That would be in the closest to the aron in the front. Like, these are the distinctively Jewish things. That's sort of
Why
the way.
lions? You know?
Yeah, it's like the guardians, right? I would assume the guardians of the aron. And there's there's
Turtle doves, it looks like?
turtle doves. There is like a lulav and srog. I guess that looks a little bit, that, you know, that one looks a little bit like a lulav.
Yeah.
I think that's, I know that there's, you know, a shofar in the bottom
shofar,
here, and
right,
that the one
yeah.
upside down doesn't look as much like shofar, but
Yeah.
it is. So that's the frontmost panel. Just take a look at the inscription. So we're missing part of the Aramaic inscription. The top, the Greek inscription, basically thanks the artisans Marianos and his son Hanina, who were the artisans here, and also the artisans that are listed in the local in the nearby Shul Beit Shan, also list the same people as the artisans. So that's the Greek inscription, and the Aramaic inscription basically saying that, you know, the shul was built during the reign of the Roman Emperor Justin I, who ruled 518 to 527, and that also it was funded by communal donations. So, you know, you come in, the plaque, like this is Ki'ilu, the plaque on the ground telling us this is communal money, and this is what dates the floor to the 6th century actually. And the inscriptions have on either side a lion and a buffalo. I don't know if you can see it in this picture. Yeah, here you have the lion and the buffalo, also like guardians protecting on the bottommost panel.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's just a zoomed
Oh,
out.
that looks like they're doing a sacrifice. Do you see like fire?
Okay, so let's look at that one, because that's the next panel,
Yeah.
which is so here's one.
Oh, that's the Akedah.
Yeah, that's the Akedah. I think I have a zoomed in version. Okay,
Wow.
so
Oh
these
my
two,
God,
this
I've never
is,
seen such a graphic picture of the Akedah like that. Wow.
and they're labeled.
Right.
Right, that's Yitzchak, it says Abraham, and then it says, I don't know if you can see, the ram is vertical, and there's all sorts of guesses as to why the ram is vertical in this picture. One might just be, well, that's the amount of space that they had, but there are all kinds of, Christian prefiguration to Christ, and it's supposed to look like the cross. I mean, there's kind of lots of different interpretation as to why the ram is vertical. Exactly. So it says Vihine Ayal, which is what it says in Torah when, and then it says Al Tishlach.
Where do you see that?
On top of.
Yes, Al Tishlach. I see it. Wow, I see it. Yeah.
I just want to go back so that maybe this one's a little bit better. No, it's hard to see there.
Yeah.
So we'll use this one. Al Tishlach.
It's so interesting that they picked this too, because think about it. I don't think in any shul today would you pick to adorn our shul with an artwork of the Akedah.
Right.
Yeah, it's just a different mindset. Maybe. Then this is like the holiest moments maybe, and for us I think modern day sensibilities, it's not so easy to reconcile that sometimes. So I don't think you would find it in artwork.
I was going to ask that. Why do you think, that exact question, why do you think they selected Akedah Yitzchak? What does it symbolize?
Them is like the pivotal moment of faith. That's a guess.
No, ultimate sacrifice.
Right, exactly.
And that's what if that's what your religious sense must be built on. And it's so interesting, right? Our shuls today probably would not choose, right, to depict Akedah Yitzchak for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
Or morally, ethically bothered. I don't know, all kinds of the spin-off Shira and Akedah Yitzchak and different artistic representations of that.
Right.
But this was not an uncommon motif in antiquity.
Yes, I've seen it before.
And then we'll compare it a little bit if we have time to the depiction in the Dura Europos shul, which we'll look at in a moment. But you have here, there's also an element of midrashic interpretation here. You have the Na'arim who came along with Abraham. So Chazal say there are interpretations that one of them was Ishmael and Eliezer. The Torah doesn't say that; it just says Na'arav. But here again, certain scholars have kind of looked at this panel and said, well, there is the midrashic interpretation that, the Na'arim are like really off to the side, which is essentially Ishmael being pushed away, and this is clear preference for Yitzchak being the selected, the chosen. It doesn't say that in the narrative in the scene, but kind of reading into they're really off to the side.
They don't appear to me they're in the back, but to me they don't appear so off to the side.
Yeah, I don't know. It's true. I mean, I read that in like 4 different places. I'm like, okay, they're off to the side. Like, I guess they're not. Maybe it's the ayal that's separating. I don't know.
Right. They're still rather prominent though.
And they're big, and they're pretty big.
Especially the one
leading the donkey is pretty big.
Yeah.
Right, which again also leads us to the question of kind of scholarship around all the art and everyone kind of guessing and surmising. You read enough and you see enough, and you can go to museums and you're like, oh yeah, obviously that's what it is. But then you have to remind yourself, like, no, take a step back. Like, this is interpretation. I don't, and could be that was how the space worked out.
Right.
It's just interesting.
Right.
Let's take a look at the central, the zodiac wheel. So in the center, we have Helios, the sun god, with his crown of thorns.
What does it say in Hebrew? Betulah?
We'll go through the Hebrew in a second. Okay. We'll go through each. So the middle is.
The middle.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
The central is this Helios, the sun god, with his chariot being pulled out of the water. Then there's the zodiac wheel with each of the signs, the symbols of the zodiac, and their corresponding names in Hebrew. We'll go through those in just a moment. And then on the 4 corners are women depicted as the seasons, right? So the 4 seasons. So this is also a very symbolic, rich work of art, interesting to just ask, like, why is this on the floor of the shul? Like, it's a common motif in the pagan world, and there are, like we said, other shuls that had it, but why is it here? Was it just kind of, this is the art of the time and we want to be in tune with that, or is there something more? So the zodiac symbols are each labeled with their corresponding Hebrew name. So, Teomim, I guess we can go through which ones. Teomim is Gemini, twins.
Oh.
And then
That must be
Sartan, Cancer. Leo, the Aryeh.
Oh, right.
Right? I wrote it all down just to make sure I had it all. Virgo, Betula.
Virgo.
The Virgin.
Interesting.
Virgo. Moznaim, Scales, Libra.
Uh-huh.
They're all Latin names, actually, right? So the Latin names. Akrav is a Scorpion, so Scorpio. Keshet is the bow. I guess I didn't know Sagittarius is some sort of. Actually, don't know what it means, but I assume it's some sort of bow.
The next one you can't see.
You can't see, but it's a Capricorn.
Oh,
so you see the front, it's the Gedi. It must be the goat. And then it says Udali, right? Water person, which is Aquarius. So there's like a bucket being pulled out. Dagim, fish, Pisces. What's next? Tlay, Aries, the ram. And Shor, the bull, Taurus. So you've got,
Wow, that's really cool.
It's really just, wow.
Yeah.
I don't know, that really.
Yeah.
Let's just look at another, and then you just see it on
That's
the floor.
That's a universal symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So the questions of universality, questions of the seasons, and then maybe, holidays falling, like when you think about time and space coming together. So this is a real, convergence. Like we talked the first week about the end of creation of the world. We had sacred time, but we didn't have sacred space. So perhaps, I don't know, the selection of the zodiac wheel is to reflect sacred time in our sacred space. And even though this is not sacred per se, the zodiac is a universal symbol, like, no, once we house the elements of time in our structure, in our building, then suddenly we're taking that which is a universal and making it sacred. Like each one of those 12ths, we have our holiday, we have our our own sanctification of the time. So again, I don't know, I have no idea, but thinking about why would the zodiac, like, is it just because it's cool art and that's what people were doing and that's what we put on the floor, or is there something more central about why specifically time in our sacred space? But the wheel, and there's just so much to look at here. I do want to just compare for a few moments, if you have. You're good. And in shuls in the diaspora, which I mentioned earlier, it's just, again, shuls were found in lots of different diverse locations. So that was, that's kind of close. Yeah. Israel, and there are many, many shuls in Israel, specifically in northern Israel, in the Galilee area, and that's where you have in Tzfat, in Beit Shan, in like there's just all up Chatzor, like there's just many, many shuls, and kind of can do an archaeological tour in northern Israel.
I'm sure they're wonderful.
There are many, and clustered together. What I found to be just so interesting is the prevalence of shuls in the diaspora in really disparate places, like I said, like we said beforehand, across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Some examples, I think, scholars know of at least 15 such shuls, like spread across in places like Dura, Europos, on the Euphrates in Syria, which we'll look at, in southeastern Spain, in Hungary, in North Africa, on the Greek islands, in Tunisia, in Macedonia, southern Italy, we said before, in the southernmost shore of Bova Marina. There was an unexpected finding in the 1990s, again, of just nobody knew that there was a community here, let alone a shul. And then suddenly, like in all these far-flung places across the Near East and the Mediterranean,
fewer, I would imagine, in the United States because it's so young.
Yeah. I mean, the oldest shul
is not. It's not Rhode Island.
It's not.
It's Savannah, right?
It's
not Savannah, North Carolina. Right?
Is it North Carolina?
I think it might be North Carolina, but I'm not sure.
I know everybody thinks that the Torah Synagogue is the oldest, but it's not actually the oldest congregation, as opposed to the oldest structure. I think that's why the what was a formalized congregation per se, as opposed to the oldest shul building. Okay, let's focus a little bit on Dura.
Okay.
Right? Dura Europos Synagogue, which Dura, this is an old sort of map of Roman Syria. So that's along the Euphrates in Syria. Dura Europos was a small Hellenistic military enclave along the Euphrates. It was a border city, and excavations there in 1932 by Yale University exposed a shul, a church, like many buildings, but the shul was very, very significant for understanding
beautiful
the idea of diaspora synagogue. What's so fascinating about the Dura Europos Synagogue, the walls were painted. There were 2 layers of frescoes that were painted, and they were almost perfectly preserved because in an attempt to fortify the city from incoming Persian forces, the Roman military fills the whole town with sand. And they poured sand into the main hall of the shul because it was a fortifying city wall. And by doing so, essentially, the paintings from, the 3rd century basically remained totally intact because the town was abandoned. It's never resettled. Here's just a picture of the filling and the burial, right? The city walls, the synagogue wall, and the street. That sand was in the middle panel, right? This sand was filled in order to fortify the city wall, but that was also one of the shul walls in the Dura Europos Synagogue. And here sort of it was done in 3 different stages, filling with sand, earth, rubble to fortify, and then everyone abandoned, and you have this building that is filled with sand. And so when they uncovered it in 1932, it was like, oh, we have these frescoes basically perfectly preserved. And there's all kinds of interesting discussions as to when you do an archaeological dig, you don't know what you're going to find. So when different parties, and there are different agreements between the people funding the dig and the home country, and who's going to keep what when they find, if they find anything. So often those agreements, they're going to look different each time. But legal, there's lots of laws. Actually, in my law days, worked on a book uncovering the past with a group of attorneys and museum directors and art collectors, essentially hammering out a scholarly review of laws of patrimony, like cultural patrimony, like who owns the stuff. And we see it all the time, and now we have more international guidelines for discussion, but just recognize that, right, there's the country where it's found, there's the sponsor of the dig, and there are different versions of a story with Dura Europos where, Yale was the one sponsoring the dig.
Why Yale?
The Yale archaeologists, just their ancient Near Eastern universities will often, like whether it's Avery, will often sponsor the archaeology, the dig, and then, we'll keep what I think what happened there's a story about how there was almost like a change in the middle. Like the university had said, if we find, we're going to keep the shul, and then in the middle of transporting it, they literally were like transporting the walls and the frescoes. The Syrian government decided that no, actually this is too important of a structure and we want it to remain in Syria. And I don't know the exact ins and outs or different versions of what exactly happened, but it's just fascinating to think about. Well, you're starting an archaeological dig. You suspect there's going to be something there. You don't know what you're going to find, and then suddenly you uncover this thing. Like, who gets it? Who does it belong to? Now, this is housed in the Damascus Museum, closed off to the public because Syria doesn't want to exhibit a shul. That would mean that, hey, there's Jewish light. Like, they would have to admit to Jewish roots or publicize Jewish roots in Syria, and that doesn't fit with the narrative that they want to spin about what Syria is today. So I have heard, but I didn't see, that the shul is not even, Der Europa Synagogue is not even on the plans of the Damascus Museum. There's like this gray shaded off area. It's there, it's physically there, it's not open to the public, and it's not even on the museum plans. There's just like a gray shaded off area, which is in fact, a reconstruction of the shul with the frescoes that were there.
With the original frescoes?
With the original frescoes.
So
the ceiling is they moved it. Yeah, they moved it. They moved it. I'm sorry. Yeah, they moved it. And that also is a super interesting discussion as to like how they move, right? Just how those things, like technically how they move. They moved it. It's part of the Damascus Museum, but not open to the public. And almost like we don't have
even the public in there.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's not open to the public.
Oh, period.
That's what I mean. I have to corroborate that.
What a shame.
But it's right. It's a crazy thing. So this is the room with the frescoes and a reconstruction of the ceiling. Obviously, the ceiling was all sorts of tiles and panels. Some were just stock figures of fruits, vegetables, people, but they reconstructed. They knew that the ceiling, based on the finding of those tiles, that the ceiling was like all panels like that. But the frescoes they're all biblical scenes. So we'll just take a look at some of them. This is just sort of the architecture of Der Europos, which was typical of ancient diaspora synagogues. There's a main hall and lots of ancillary rooms where different things are happening, hostel or batei midrash or all kinds of things. This is just one picture of, that would have been the Aron, and then there are 58 scenes from Tanakh that are depicted on the wall.
It's so detailed.
And the date, it dates to about 200 and, in the middle of the 3rd century, so 244 CE. There's an Aramaic inscription also dating the shul. The working theory was that it was a private home that was converted, although it's very large. And 58 scenes in total. We'll look at some of them. Again, stylistically, it's important to recognize that their contemporary Greco-Roman style and technique is being used. Scholars debate whether or not there is a single theme that unites all of the different scenes. Here we have a picture of Moshe, right, being pulled out of the water, the handmaids,
Why 2 babies, though?
So I think it's just, it's
one
him being passed,
passed
right?
along,
Like this is his mother. I even just, was looking at this again last night, and different things were jumping out at me each time, just looking at like how the women holding Moshe and passing Moshe, presumably Yocheved, that just their clothing is so distinctively different from the Egyptian handmaidens. In the middle, they're not covering their arms. They are covering their arms. The women who are wider, presumably having given birth, the nursemaid, as opposed to the young women. It's just fascinating to see stylistically how they're depicting the scene. There's also Kriyat Yam Suf. So it's not the clearest. I couldn't find such a clear. I know that Yale University has digital images that are super clear, but I think you have to get permission from museum to just access them. This is Shmuel anointing David. kind of that is one of the scenes. There's an enormous scene, I don't have a picture of it, of the vision of Yecheskel and the Valley of the Dry Bones. And so that actually takes up a very, very large amount of space on the wall, which has led certain scholars to say that there is a theme here, and it's the end of days, messianic, eschatological, based on the fact that that painting takes up such an enormous amount of space. Moshe being rescued is also a sense of, like, along with that. Another theory as to the unification, is there a theme uniting them, is based on
Women,
Esther, and questions of almost like polemical propaganda in terms of how the oppressors and those persecuting us won't prevail, like which was really important for diaspora Jewry in particular to have as their narrative. The Esther panel, I think we'll just focus on for a moment, is front and center. It's to the left of the Aron. So if we go back to that, that picture. So here, the Aron would be in the middle, immediately to the left of it. That's that big Esther scene. So kind of just going back to the Esther scene, what does that say? This is a shul in Syria during the time that the Persian Empire existed. Like, there is that almost a question of support, perhaps, for the idea of diaspora Jewry, or maybe even for the Persian Empire. You'll see that Mordechai is actually dressed here. Mordechai is on the horse, being led by Haman. Haman is dressed as a Roman nobleman. Mordechai is in Persian garb, contemporary kind of Persian garb. There are 4 people in the middle. I don't know what exactly they're doing there. Achashverosh is getting some kind of a message. If you see, there's like a piece of paper being handed to him. The messenger who's reaching up.
Oh,
there's some sort of message being delivered to him. Esther behind with a halo. Interesting. I think there's a crown halo last night. In one of the images, it really looked like a halo, but that headpiece leads us to raise all sorts of questions. How do we interpret this, the centrality of this in the Zura synagogue? Perhaps it's a contemporary commentary. Jews are supporting 3rd century Persian Empire over Rome. I don't know. Is that like why this one was so big and so central? Why they're dressed the way they are? Haman, the bad guy, is dressed as a Roman. Mordechai, the good guy, is dressed as a Persian nobleman. Political commentary through the art, not just religious symbolism, education narrative. You have that, perhaps, I don't know. These are just, all working theories. And when you just take one panel out of the 58 panels, and you can kind of go through all the panels.
That's amazing.
And it's just an astounding number, and the preservation is really...
Must have been huge. Wow.
Yeah. We can go on. I'm going to stop soon so that you can go, but we can, keep going on and on. It just kind of leads us to think of art as, just to kind of get back to the first question, art not just as a 2-dimensional pretty image that we decorate our sacred space with, but all the other things that we talked about in terms of community building and education and political commentary and religious icon and all the other questions that spawn off conversations, tying together our religious sensibility, our aesthetic, our intellectual kind of sensibility, all into one big conversation that really lends itself. So, to be continued.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't talk too much.
Loved it.
Really?
This is not. I love that.